Deputy Speaker, it's beyond belief that it's been 3 years on from the terrible night at Grenfell Tower. And I want to begin by paying my respects to those who lost their lives, and we remember them today in this debate. And we are also incredibly grateful to their family members and neighbours and the survivors for campaigning, despite all they went through, for the safety of properties that are cladded with dangerous ACM and also other properties that are at risk. There are, Madam Deputy Speaker, still an estimated 60,000 people living in homes with similar ACM cladding on the outside of their buildings, and many more are living in buildings that are dangerous. And according to the Fire Brigades Union, there are some 500,000 people at risk of living in unsafe housing across the UK. And each night they are going to bed knowing that a fire in their building could spread quickly if it caught fire and because of flammable cladding. And they know their chances of survival are seriously lessened in that context. And they know that progress to remove that cladding has been slowed down, has been slow, and it's slowed further because of the pandemic. And so, therefore, I've called for this debate because I think it's vital that ministers step up and make sure that those blocks that need the cladding removed and other dangerous materials, that happens as a matter of urgency. It took, Madam Deputy Speaker, a year for the government to agree to fund the removal of ACM cladding in high-rise social blocks, and then 2 years for private blocks, and 3 years for other commitments to be made. And it happened because of the actions of campaign groups like Grenfell United, the UK Cladding Action Group, Inside Housing, as well as members of Parliament and other charities and housing organisations. But it's not good enough, because the government's had to do this kicking and screaming rather than taking responsibility, as was promised at the time of the fire. And while £1.6 billion of government funding is welcome, the government's own estimates suggest that it requires between £3 and £3.5 billion to make all buildings safe. And residents feel like prisoners in their homes. They cannot sell or remortgage their flats, and the external wall fire review, the ESW1 form process, is not sufficient, and it's costly and takes too long, and they're trapped. I give way to my honourable friend.
My honourable friend raised this important point about the paperwork needed. Many residents live in homes that are not as unsafe as others, but without that form, they're unable to sell. And one of the things that the Public Accounts Committee picked up in our hearing the other week was that professional indemnity insurance, the lack of being unable to get that, is one of the real breaks on this. Does she agree that the government needs to step in on this issue too?
Yes, absolutely. And I hope that the Minister, along with his Treasury colleagues, will look at this very quickly to resolve the matter, because it affects people who are trying to sell homes, and I've seen that in my own constituency. I'll give way to my honourable.
I thank my honourable friend. Of course, she's making absolutely crucial points about the UK government's responsibility in this area. And of course, fire safety issues go well beyond the issue of cladding, but also to other matters such as compartmentation and fire safety measures. Does she agree that the original developers of building also need to take a huge responsibility in this? For example, Lang O'Rourke in my own constituency are refusing to engage with the Celestia development residents about the fire safety issues that they are responsible for in defects in the construction. Does she not think that they need to meet with them and take their responsibilities?
I agree absolutely with my honourable friend, and I'm going to come on to this point, but I think the Minister, I hope, will address this point about the need for private developers, freeholders, to take action. And if they're not, what proposals the Minister has, including the House of Commons Select Committee, the Housing Committee's recommendation of compulsory purchasing, if required, if they don't act, because we can't just rely on their goodwill, because some of them don't have the goodwill to take action and people's lives are at risk. The government's latest release in June revealed that 455 high-rise buildings identified to be covered in ACM by the MHCLG. Of those, 155 have had cladding removed, but another 300 are yet to be remediated. That's a lot of housing that needs to be remediated. And the government's repeatedly missed its own deadlines of 2019 for social sector blocks and June 2020 for private sector blocks. And despite the major fires in 2019 at student accommodation blocks with high-pressure laminate cladding in Bolton and in the flats in the constituency of my right honourable friend, the member for Barking, where flames quickly spread up the timber balconies, progress has been painfully slow. And the coronavirus pandemic has hampered progress even more, as I said before. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you very much for giving way. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the leaseholders of St Francis Tower, Ipswich, who had absolutely no say or power to stop dangerous HPL cladding being put on the town in which they live, are right to feel aggrieved that they now receive letters harassing them for a payment of a removal of that cladding? And does my honourable friend agree with me that the government should support those leaseholders and eliminate that uncertainty and anxiety?
I couldn't agree more, and I have called on the government time and again in these kinds of debates for the government to use its powers and stand with leaseholders and take action, because at the moment leaseholders are being expected to take legal action against powerful, wealthy developers and owners, and that is not a fair balance. And to this day the government's failed to act, and government could use its powers and its might to help those people. These are hard-working families who worked really hard to get on the property ladder. These are people who work in the NHS. These are people who are keeping us safe and alive, and this government should be stepping up to support leaseholders. I'll give way to...
My friend agree that the government's response has been entirely inadequate here. Not only are not all tall buildings with flammable cladding identified, but it also ought to include medium-rise buildings above 11 metres high and those which have vulnerable occupants like hospitals and care homes.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and the MHCLG Select Committee found that the £1 billion building safety fund, would only pay for 600 of the buildings, when actually we need billions in order to make sure all buildings in the country that are in this unsafe status need to be addressed. I give way to my
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend who's making an excellent argument. Isn't it particularly unsatisfactory that ministers have signed up to the principles that leaseholders should not have to bear these costs, but not provided the funds to make a reality of it?
Absolutely, and what we're finding is that the small print that housing associations are having to pass and local authorities are having to pass is actually excluding them from accessing funding, and then they are having to pass on the bill to leaseholders that the honourable gentleman has talked about and others have talked about, and our leaseholder constituents cannot afford tens of thousands of pounds when right now their jobs are on the line, they're struggling to make ends meet, they're struggling to feed their kids, middle class families are having to rely on food banks in this crisis, and they're worried about what's going to happen to their housing. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I congratulate the Honourable Lady on bringing this forward. She has been a champion when it comes to highlighting this issue, and I want to congratulate her on that there, first of all. With a large number of Northern Ireland students in university flats and housing, some of them my constituents, by the way, I have a real concern regarding the number of our students in unsafe housing. Does the Honourable Lady agree that universities and landlords must do more to upgrade student housing to the highest standards to ensure that what happened at Grenfell doesn't happen there either?
I absolutely agree with the honourable gentleman, and I would urge the Minister to use his powers and his position to look at these issues in the round so that he can sleep at night and feel comfortable that he's done everything to protect people, because ultimately we have a duty of care and responsibility to our citizens, and I hope that he will do all he can to address these points today. My own local authority has 49 ACM-clad high-rise blocks, among the highest in the country, and I have had representations, Madam Deputy Speaker, from so many of my constituents over the last few years, where they've had, it's been years now, they've had to pay, leaseholders had to pay for the fire safety wardens. They were originally told it would take a few months, and it's been years. And they are worried about their safety, and with no end in sight on when the work would be completed. While it's been done for some blocks, not for others. And a number of people have been told that the the housing providers won't be able to provide the fire service reports. And I hope that the Minister can give clarity on the need for transparency, whether they're private developers who own the freehold or housing associations, that they provide the fire safety reports, because without those, it's very difficult for our residents to know how much they would have to pay if there isn't government funding, but also how to make plans for their future. And those... I'll give way.
Thank you very much. Thank you for you for having this debate. Would you agree with me that many of my constituents in the Riverside, in Swish and in the Argento Tower are facing this same limbo of no end in sight? So the fund needs to be given out more quickly and transparency there. And would you agree that the Minister is not doing enough to explain about these funds and when they will be made available for residents?
The Honourable Lady mind just saying, would the Honourable Lady agree rather than you?
Would the Honourable Lady agree with me?
Thank you very much.
I would agree with my honourable friend. And as the Minister can see, this is a short debate, but there's a lot of interest and concern. And I hope that he heeds those concerns and addresses those points and really looks carefully about how we can unblock these issues so that people can get the results they need so that they can live safely. One of my constituents said, I spend all day stressed at the thought of losing my home. At night, I'm anxious about the possibility of fire. I haven't slept well for months and don't see any end in the situation. I'm trapped. I cannot sell. I'm not allowed to rent the flat out. I'm forced to stay here. It now feels like a prison. Another said, I feel suicidal. And another said, I can't sleep from worry. Because of COVID-19, I could lose my job any day now. And when that happens, I won't be able to pay my mortgage or sell my flat. Because of cladding, I will end up losing everything I have worked for. It's a big worry that affects my mental health and sleep. It's not fair for the government to allow housing associations and construction companies to sell us unsafe houses, and we are now getting punished for their mistakes. Madam Deputy Speaker, housing providers have an obligation to ensure that they are doing everything that they can to make buildings safe, but the government has the ultimate responsibility to ensure that they have access to the funds in order to do so. And the government took a lot of time before they provided those funds and gave private developers and freeholders plenty of time to get their act together. They haven't. So it is time the government used its powers to make this happen. And ministers have repeatedly said that those buildings, those private owners have the responsibility to act. But actually, the government is shirking its responsibility, but by leaving it to their goodwill, the goodwill of building owners. And yet many of them have complex ownership structures in other countries, including for tax avoidance purposes, to apply for a limited first-come, first-served funding fund. Or to pay for the works themselves. And many of them have found cunning ways to avoid paying anything and leaving our constituents high and dry and not being able to live safely in their homes. And this is unacceptable, and it's got to stop. And our government needs to act and go after them. We've said this time and time again, and it's not happened. So I call on the Minister to address the following points. Can he explain what powers he will use to make private developers and freeholders end the delays and remove the cladding? Whether he will increase the Building Safety Fund to cover the costs of cladding removal and other fire risks to all buildings that are in that position. And if he will provide a clear timeline on remediation that the government sticks to, and what plans he has for ensuring that upcoming legislation improves fire safety and building regulation. And also whether he would consider primary legislation that goes far enough to prevent another tragedy, as well as increasing funding and resources for the fire services to carry out the vital preventative inspection work. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would draw the Minister's attention in particular to the recommendation of the MHCLG Select Committee, who say the government should give urgent consideration to the establishment of a new national body whose sole purpose is to purchase the freehold and manage the remediation of buildings with serious fire safety defects. Any residential building where works have not commenced by December 2020 should be subject to a CPO. The national body would step in where overburdened local authorities are unable to act. Once remediated, buildings should be converted to common hold and returned to leaseholders. This, in my view, appears to be a reasonable and proportionate way forward, given if those companies haven't acted. And I hope the Minister will be able to respond to whether he would consider that. And if he's not prepared to consider that, we just need action. So if he comes up with another creative way of making things happen to keep our constituents safe, now is the moment to set out those plans, and I hope he will. Madam Deputy Speaker, after Grenfell, the then Prime Minister said, "My government will do whatever it takes to keep our people safe." 3 years on, this government has been found wanting. So I implore the Minister and his government to honour the commitments that were made by his party in government when this tragedy happened. It was a man-made disaster that should have been avoided, and we need to learn from that, and we need to make sure that we all do everything we can to keep people safe, and that the government honours the commitments and honours those who lost their lives, makes the funds available, creates the legal framework and the requirements to make sure our constituents can live without fear safely in their homes. Thank you.
Minister Christopher Pincher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, the member for Bethnal Green and Bow, for bringing this topic to the House today and for securing this important adjournment debate. As you will know, Madam Deputy Speaker, she secured a similar debate in April last year. I know it is a matter of very considerable importance in her constituency, and I want to pay tribute and write into the record her work that she's doing on behalf of her constituents. And I should also like to thank, Madam Deputy Speaker, all those members who've taken the time to intervene on behalf of their constituents this evening on the challenges of remediating high-rise residential buildings with unsafe cladding systems, particularly in the light of COVID-19. Madam Deputy Speaker, we established our building safety programme within days of the Grenfell Tower fire. Its aim remains now, as it was then, to ensure residents of high-rise blocks of flats are safe, now and in the future. Our aim has been clear from the outset. Unsafe ACM cladding of the type found on Grenfell Tower and other dangerous cladding must be removed from high-rise residential buildings. It is therefore our priority to ensure unsafe ACM cladding is removed and replaced swiftly and at no cost to leaseholders. While many responsible building owners have taken action, some, as the Honourable Lady says, have not. Too many building owners and managing agents in the private sector have been too slow in getting remediation work started. I will give way very briefly, but I haven't got very much time.
Thank you very much for giving way. There's currently a legal dispute going on between the freeholder of St Francis Tower, Ipswich, and the contractor who put the unsafe cladding onto the building. Surely that is an admittance from both parties that it's one of them to blame and not the leaseholder, yet they're in the middle getting harassed to pay fees that they shouldn't have to pay.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm obliged to my honourable friend for that intervention. I won't dwell upon any particular tower block or issue, but let me simply say that it is our intention to make sure that leaseholders should not have to foot the bill. Building owners and building managers and their agents should be looking after their buildings, and that's why the government has intervened with funding and with specialist support, and we won't tolerate any further delays. Where building owners are failing to make acceptable progress, those responsible should expect local authorities and fire and rescue services to take tougher enforcement action. At the end of May, of the 455 identified high-rise buildings with ACM cladding, 209 buildings have either completed remediation or had their ACM cladding systems removed. A further 86 have started remediation, though not yet had ACM cladding removed. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, while there has been progress, we are under no illusion that there is more, much more, to be done. For the removal of unsafe ACM cladding, we are aiming that all building owners have works on site by the end of 2020, with completion of remedial works by the end of 2021. It is a challenge, but one we are determined to achieve. Even with public funding available, the pace has been much too slow. We recognise that remediation is a complex undertaking and that every building is different. We also understand building owners don't always have the requisite expertise or experience to advance the work. And that's why we've recently appointed Faithful and Gould as specialist construction consultants to help responsible entities increase capacity and capability and directly support them through the remediation process. F&G is currently working with those buildings identified as being most at risk of missing the end-of-year date. They're examining project plans and seeking ways to reduce timescales to mobilise projects. Madam Deputy Speaker, overall the Government has set aside £1.6 billion in funding for the remediation of ACM and other types of unsafe cladding from high-rise residential buildings in the private and social housing sectors. We made this money available to support the remediation of unsafe cladding. A large proportion of this support will protect leaseholders from costs. Now, we recognise there are wider remediation costs which will need to be met to ensure the safety of existing blocks of flats. However, the public funding does not absolve the industry from taking responsibility for any failures that led to unsafe cladding materials being put on those buildings in the first place. And we expect developers, investors and building owners who have the means to pay to take responsibility and cover the cost of remediation themselves without passing on costs to leaseholders. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government has committed £600 million to remediate buildings in the public, social and private sector and speed up the pace of remediation of ACM cladding. In the private sector, while some developers said they would meet the costs, it became clear that a significant number of building owners could not or would not do so, meaning funding would be needed to be made available to enable progress to be made. And that's why in May 2019 we announced £200 million of funding would be available for ACM remediation in private sector buildings, and the fund was opened for applications in September that year. As of May 2020, the Department expects to pay for 94 projects in the private sector where the developer or building owner has not agreed to fund remediation work themselves. The owners of 84 private sector residential buildings have committed to funding the remediation works themselves, with a further 23 self-funded through accepted warranty claims. We are working with a handful of other buildings where a funding route has yet to be agreed. The availability of funding and direct practical support for building owners means there can be no excuses for further delays. For those who fail to make acceptable progress, tougher sanctions are coming. First through our fire safety bill, currently before Parliament, and subsequently when our new building safety regime comes into place. Madam Deputy Speaker, we have always acknowledged there are materials other than ACM cladding that are of concern. We have been providing advice of their removal to building owners since 2017. The highest priority has been the removal of the type of ACM used on Grenfell Tower because it poses the most severe safety risk. But there are other unsafe cladding materials which must also be removed. And that is why in March this year we announced an additional £1 billion of funding for the remediation of unsafe non-ACM cladding in the social and private residential sectors. We expect usage commit for this funding in full by the end of 2021, March 2021. So we expect it all to be committed by that date. The new Building Safety Fund will cover high-rise buildings with unsafe non-ACM cladding, such as some types of high-pressure laminate. The issue of Waking Watch was also raised by the Honourable Lady and by other honourable and right honourable members. Madam Deputy Speaker, I know leaseholders have concerns about costs of interim measures, costs which have been heightened due to the COVID-19 emergency. These interim measures include Waking Watches. Waking Watch is meant to be a short-term tool. It is no substitute for remediation. But the only way to remove the need for interim measures is to remove unsafe cladding as quickly as possible. And that is why we are prioritising £1.6 billion of public subsidy on remediation of unsafe cladding. That said, my noble friend Lord Greenhalgh, the Minister with responsibility for building safety in the other place, is investigating what we can do to reduce the cost of Waking Watch. This includes publishing data on the costs of Waking Watch to ensure greater transparency on costs. Moreover, the National Fire Chiefs Council is updating its guidance. We have asked the Fire Protection Board to advise fire and rescue services on how best to operationalise the revised guidance, including looking into measures such as installing building-wide fire alarm systems. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll give way very briefly to the Right Honourable Lady.
So simply, in the time he's got available, we won't be able to answer. Will he commit to looking at this issue of professional indemnity insurance? It does need a good political fix at the top.
I'm pleased, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Right Honourable Lady has mentioned professional indemnity insurance. Let me assure her that following my Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State's commitment to review the situation on April the 2nd of this year, I believe, from memory, my noble friend Lord Greenhalgh has met with members of the insurance industry and also other fire and safety professionals. I think the last meeting was on the 30th of June, and he is investigating at pace ways in which this particular issue may be remedied. Madam Deputy Speaker, our landmark Building Safety Bill, announced in December, will bring the biggest change in our building safety regime for a generation. It builds on the recommendations of Dame Judith Hackett's independent review of building regulations and fire safety. It contains provisions to help remedy the systemic failings that resulted in the Grenfell Tower fire. The new regime will give residents a stronger voice in an improved system of fire safety, overseen by a more effective regulatory framework, including stronger powers to inspect high-rise buildings and sanctions to tackle irresponsible behaviour. Madam Deputy Speaker, much progress has been made since the Honourable Member secured a similar debate in April of last year. We've set aside £1.6 billion of funding to support the issue and resolve it. We've appointed specialist consultants to increase the pace of remediation, and we've introduced the Fire Safety Bill to strengthen enforcement action. But the hard work must continue, and it will. We will shortly publish the draft Building Safety Bill, a once-in-a-generation change to the building safety regime. It will be instrumental not only in shaping future policy to allow the new regime to prevent fire safety defects occurring in the first place, but also ensure people are safe and feel safe in their homes. We will continue to work tirelessly to bring about the lasting change we need for the future of building safety and the future of all the people living in towers in our country.